Welcome to the latest edition of the Lownie Report. Another busy week in terms of revelations from the Epstein papers. I've been appearing quite a lot on the media, including on Good Morning Britain, written articles for the Daily Mail, the Sunday Times, and the Spectator Diary this week. And we've had some very interesting interventions from people like Gordon Brown, writing in this New Statesman. Peter Hunt, a former royal correspondent, has been on Newsnight and has actually been very open about the need for accountability in the royal family. So many of the things I've been talking about for the last decade now seem to be in the mainstream, being picked up by broadcasters and journalists. And I really feel that there's been a sea change, even in the last week, in terms of social media pressure on the royals. Clearly, the members of the royal family are being heckled, and a sense that maybe things might be about to change. There have been calls clearly for Andrew to testify to Senate, and we've had, of course, the opening of an investigation into Andrew by the Metropolitan Police. So it looks like this story is definitely going to run and run, and we may be getting even further revelations in the course of the next few weeks.
So let's start with the first major statement that came out this week, and this was the Prince and Princess of Wales. And you were quite scathing about that statement in your Substack on Monday, and it went down pretty badly across the board. Why do you think it was such a misstep, and why do you think it took so long for the Prince and Princess of Wales to say anything at all?
Well, I think, a lot of people will say that it's not their job to make any sort of dramatic statement. They are only the Prince and Princess of Wales. The statement needs to come from the King, and they were kind of this was a holding note, really, until the King had spoken. My own feeling is that they were slightly exasperated and impatient that nothing was being said, and they felt that they needed to drop something in, at least to show that there was some concern in royal circles and to take the story back to victims. So that, I think, didn't quite get the mood right, and I think that perhaps may have actually persuaded the King to do his own statement shortly afterwards. Maybe it was on the books anyway, I don't know. And that was a little better, but I think still a little mealy-mouthed, really. I think the public opinion really wants something much stronger. It's a scene really like 1997 after Diana's death. And I do think that the palace needs to be much more open about what they knew, when they knew it, what they did at the time, behind the scenes, and what they're going to do now. And there are lots of things they can clearly do. I think they can clearly put pressure on Andrew to testify to set the Senate. I think Parliament should be asking him to testify, and there could be some pressure there. And I think they need to be very clear that the police protection officers will be encouraged to describe Andrew's movements and give testimony to the police. I heard a rather worrying story from Paul Page, who was one of the policemen on the North Gate, and he in fact showed me the letter from the Metropolitan Police, reminding her of his obligations not to break any confidences and actually not to speak out. And I think if that is the case, and he says that this has come from the orders at the palace rather than from the Met, that sounds like what Charles is saying in public is very different to what he's doing in private.
How well briefed behind the scenes would the King and Queen be, and indeed the Prince and Princess of Wales, about what Andrew may have got up to?
Well, it's very interesting. When I did my book on the Duke of Windsor, I found extraordinary levels of briefing in the papers, in the private papers of the Duke of Windsor at the Royal Archives. And it was very clear that his protection officer was reporting on him and that there was, we know, surveillance on Edward by MI5, and that was reported back. And we do know the intelligence services did have Andrew and Sarah Ferguson under surveillance because of the people they were associating with. And those reports clearly could be shown, requested by the palace. We've got the logs of people coming in and out. There must be internal correspondence, for example, relating to complaints that were made to the palace, which I knew were made by people in the Foreign Office and even from the intelligence services. So there must be a welter of material that could be used to brief members of the royal family. I mean, they must now expect to be asked these questions, and they need to be prepared. So this is what's causing me concern, that though they had this information, they clearly until now have done very little.
And to some extent, the Epstein emails, which armies of journalists and researchers and citizen journalists are going through day by day, and we're still finding out revelations day by day. And to some extent, it seems like Epstein is almost the kind of Rosetta Stone of an industrial sex trafficking network. And equally, it also looks to me like Andrew could be a kind of Rosetta Stone because of what you say, because of this extraordinary network of royal protection, of official documents, of surveillance. that actually the key to unlocking what was going on here, and it's also something that Gordon Brown alludes to, the key to unlocking what's going on here could actually be Andrew and the Royal Protection Staff and the diplomatic staff and indeed the domestic staff.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I mean, I think that's why people feel that he would be an important witness to the Senate investigation, because clearly he would have seen things, he would have heard things, and that clearly could be very material to building cases against particular individuals. But yeah, there must be plenty of evidence of what he was up to that should be passed to the police. And I think it will just get a sense of how serious Charles is about his offer of cooperation when we sort of get some sense of what actually has been provided.
You mentioned before that records have been destroyed. Do we know the extent to which they have been destroyed? And might there still be kind of carbon copies or other ways of getting at that information if some of it has at least been destroyed?
Yes, well, I think the interesting thing is that when a policeman requested the logs for the North Gate, he was told, first of all, that they were covered by national security, then they'd been destroyed. Now, I don't think either of those excuses really stand up. So, yes, there's a good chance this stuff has been kept. I know that Andrew spent the Christmas period actually getting rid of documents, destroying them. It's what exactly his father did in the last years of his life. So we may have seen things destroyed, but of course we never know what is destroyed. There's no public record, and that's true of general records as well. I've managed to get figures, for example, from the Foreign Office about the number of files they destroy each year, something like 16,000. But we don't know what those files are. And when I asked if there were details, they said that it wasn't worth their time providing them, which I think is kind of worrying because, these are bits of history which are being destroyed. And I think we need to know at least what is being destroyed. So I hope what's happening at the moment will lead to greater accountability, a proper records management, maybe a different system so that sort of records of people like Andrew aren't subject to them being able to do with them as they want, but they are properly recorded like government records and eventually put in the National Archives. So this Epstein crisis is raising all sorts of other issues. But you're absolutely right. Epstein was running this huge operation. He had lots of clearly helpers who were doing it. I think one of the extraordinary things is that people like Leslie Groff and others, Sarah Kellen, who I think gave some evidence at one point and pleaded the fifth, have not been called to testify again. I mean, there are members of staff, for example, who appeared in television programs who don't seem to be approached. So it seems on both sides of the Atlantic, the police don't really want to look into this story because they're frightened of what they might find. And that needs to change.
And this scandal has very nearly brought down the Prime Minister. It might still bring down Keir Starmer. And that's because he appointed Mandelson, having known that Mandelson was still friends with Epstein. But there's been no suggestion that Mandelson has been involved in the abuse. Given that the King was likely aware that Andrew was not just involved with Epstein, but was involved in trafficking women and potentially abusing them too. Do you think the King's position is under threat?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think there are, I mean, calls on radio programs now for him to abdicate, to use the excuse of his illness, to step aside and to give William a chance to clean up the mess since he doesn't seem to be doing it. I mean, my own feeling is that, his reign will be defined by how he deals with Epstein. If he is prepared to clean out the stables, give a clean slate to William, really bite the bullet and be honest about what was known. We know, for example, the royal family, several members of the royal family contributed to the 12 million that was paid to Gifford. I mean, what's interesting is some of the things that the press are saying now, which is they claim is completely new, was actually in my book. I did, I think, a breakdown of how the payments were made. And I certainly had a whole series of other things about, for example, sharing confidential information as a trade envoy, which everyone's getting excited about now. But I think the king is in a difficult position. He's losing trust and respect, seen as weak, and protecting his younger brother. And I think he does need to be much more ruthless in how he deals with this problem, because otherwise it will lead to not the end of the monarchy, but certainly a diminution in its popularity. We're already seeing the figure dropping to just over 50%.
It's also quite depressing that the King's statement came after he was heckled, after Camilla was heckled, and then I think he was heckled again. It's only come because he wants to protect himself. It hasn't come because he wants to protect or indeed find justice for these hundreds, if not thousands, of women who were abused.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that he only operated in October after the heckling at Lichfield, and I think it seems to be exactly the same. It does seem to be effective. I mean, we do seem to get statements and things happening, and I think it perhaps doesn't look at social media but it does give a sense of the strength of public opinion, which is pretty angry. It's back to the sense of elites operating in their own self-interest to the detriment of the general population. And this belief that the monarchy, which is meant to set the example for probity and integrity, has basically let everyone down. I mean, let's just consider what the situation is. This is financial corruption and sexual deviance by a senior royal, right at the heart of the royal family, and actually protected and perhaps even enabled by the institution itself. It's a very, very serious problem, and I'm not sure they realize they've read the room properly yet.
So we know from your book that Andrew was bringing prostitutes into various royal palaces for many, many years, including after Epstein. How would he have done this? Would it have been a member of staff that would have helped procure this? Would he have had a kind of pimp that he was in contact with? Because presumably it wasn't Andrew calling up a prostitute. There must have been a system around him, like you say, that enabled it. Do we know any more about how he organized these prostitutes in Buckingham Palace in Royal Lodge?
Well, certainly on his trips abroad, there seems to have been either his hosts, like King of Thailand or someone, would provide, or particularly in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, they would provide the escorts. In this country, I think there were staff. I'm told that they even had someone doing it when he was in the Navy, amazingly enough. But yes, I think a private secretary, possibly an equerry, certainly members of his staff. I mean, I know talking to members of his staff that prostitutes were picked up from Heathrow and brought to him on a regular basis. And clearly that would have been organized by his staff, by his own. This was when he had actually lost his royal position. So this was privately employed staff, secretaries. But yeah, I mean, who ordered the police escort when he came up to the Duchess of Kent's funeral? Well, presumably the police coordinating with one of his secretaries. And certainly I know that Amanda Thirst would make requests to diplomats saying, for example, he likes blondes. So she was involved certainly in making some of those requests. I've certainly been told that.
So there might be a case that some of his staff should be charged.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is where, it begins to open a can of worms. I keep saying that once you start picking at this ball of wool, the whole thing will begin to unfurl. And you're absolutely right. There's no logical reason why those who abetted him should not also be investigated.
And how do you think the royal rota has fared throughout this entire saga? Because it seems to me that they've dropped the ball and shown themselves not to be fit for purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are now talking about the end of the Royal Rota. I talked to the Foreign Press Association yesterday, who, of course, not part of the Royal Rota and rather resent it. They have been much more, shall we say, determined in their reporting. The problem is with particularly with certain papers, they have just put out the standard palace line. And so we've been fed a whole series of stories about Andrew's mental health, the daughters being innocent victims of their parents' activities, etc., none of which is really true. And it is a shame that they don't seem to be challenging and doing the job of journalists and actually investigating for themselves whether this PR spin actually has any validity at all.
How different is the reporting in the international press versus reporting in the UK press? So, for example, there was a huge chasm, as you wrote in your book, the Tracer King, when it came to Edward and Wallace. And similarly with the George Smith, Michael Fawcett rape allegations about 20 years ago, they were reported extensively abroad, but barely touched by the UK press. Is there still a disparity between the way this is being reported in the UK and the way it's being reported abroad?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, it was interesting when I talked to the Foreign Press Association yesterday. I mean, we were about 80 people. It was a meeting called very much at the last minute. I spent over an hour doing interviews with people after my talk and really, really interested about particularly whether he would speak to the Senate. So yeah, I do think that those sort of journalists, and I think we're seeing it with stuff on Substack and some of the podcasts, those are asking the really tough questions, and they're the ones doing the research and going through the material. I mean, it's really citizen journalists who are driving this story in some ways. And so I do think that we do now need to look at the Royal Rota. I don't know quite how that changes. I mean, I suppose it comes from the palace to say we will now brief everyone on the same terms, and there won't be any favourites. Clearly, there will be certain journalists and papers that will fight against that, and I suspect there will still be preferential briefing behind the scenes. But I think a more open form of dealing with the press, I think, is now warranted.
And one of the themes of the relationship between the royal family and the press is that there's almost never any interviews. The Queen basically never gave an interview. Charles tends to do kind of documentary puff pieces. William and Kate have done more interviews certainly than Charles and Queen Elizabeth II. But the way in which a member of Parliament has to have an interview and to be challenged and questioned is just there's a convention that we don't do that with the royal family. Do you think that's something that might change or might even need to change for them to have any kind of integrity going forward?
Yes, I think people want them to appear accountable. They want a sort of more natural engagement than these rather stiff and, as you say, very controlled set pieces. I mean, what's interesting is the Duke of Edinburgh, way back in the 60s, and was actually doing lots of programs, being interviewed. And so we've sort of gone back a little bit and they've kind of tightened things. I mean, one of the problems I had researching the book was actually there was so few statements by Prince Andrew. I mean, Sarah Ferguson was always giving interviews, so there was lots of material there. But he gave very, very few interviews. And again, very controlled, always to organizations like Tatler, who they knew wouldn't say anything too critical. And yeah, I think that we have reached a tipping point where they're going to have to be much more engaged with the press and responsive to them rather than just telling them things.
So, in an email that was uncovered this week, Epstein said to Mandelson that he had advised Sarah Ferguson to announce that she was going to go to rehab for an addiction to prescription drugs after the News of the World sting. She obviously didn't do that, but did you come across anything in your research to suggest that she had a problem with drugs, prescription or otherwise?
Yes, I mean, that material was taken out of the book. There was an episode with a man called Jack Temple where he actually spoke about it. She was mixing diet pills with alcohol, but she was on a lot of medication, all sorts of different medications, particularly, for example, Prozac at one point. So, yeah, there's a long history of addiction to various drugs. And I think that may explain sometimes this very wild-eyed look that you have with her, and sometimes actually even with him. But that was very interesting because we took a lot of the drug stuff out of the book. There were all sorts of stories about her, and when she was in Verbier about drugs, Paddy McNally had actually threatened to sue papers when they tried to run the story at the time of the engagement. And I'm now looking at the drugs thing again because clearly that is an important factor, I think, to her rather volatile behavior sometimes.
Yeah, it would explain the impulsivity, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the reasons Epstein suggested this to Sarah Ferguson is because one of the ways that she's managed to rehabilitate her career after countless scandals is to play the pity card. That's a theme in her second book, Finding Sarah, I think it was called.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's also a theme of all the various press interviews that she gave after the fake shake sting. So, given what you know about Sarah Ferguson, and given reports that she is working with a ghostwriter to write another memoir, how do you think she's going to play it? How is she going to use pity again to try and rehabilitate her career?
Well, I think she'll play on the sympathies with her cancer diagnosis, with her mother leaving home when she was 13. I think maybe she always does it in a way, she kind of disassociates herself. So that was Sarah Ferguson. This is Duchess of York or whatever. But you're right, it's the same playbook time and time again, and everyone seems to buy it, even though it's a repeat performance. And I think they're just very gullible people, particularly in the States, who buy into this, and it gives them some sort of they identify with her because they feel she's gone to the bottom and can still rise up again. And so she gives them hope. But it's a very cynical exercise. We know that what she says in private is very different to what she says in public. But it's interesting to think how she might do it. I think she will focus on her friendship with Diana. She will have talk about the Queen a lot. She will, I think, try and stress her humanitarian side. I think she's always stressing what a great mother she is, though I discovered that she wasn't. So I think, again, some of the things that we saw in previous books that she used to try and win sympathy, she'll do again. But I'm not sure people are really going to buy into it anymore because they just know how cynical and hypocritical she is.
And in your kind of role as a literary agent, what kind of advance do you think she could expect to get for a book like this?
Well, certainly seven figures, depending on what she says, particularly if it's tied into a major interview. So this could be another Spare. And I think that was the most successful book in British publishing history, I think. If she's prepared to dish the dirt, the one, I think, restraint on her will be how that will affect the future of her daughters. And if it's going to jeopardize their position in the royal family and their future ability to make money in the Middle East, for example, using their titles, then I think she may cut back. I mean, we've had several instances when I was researching the book where she was talking to publishers and newspapers about exposés, and then presumably some pressure was put on her, or she had second thoughts and she pulled back. But she was using cutouts like John Bryan. There's a story, the John Bryan and Alan Starkey serial in the News of the World that was done. I understand that she may well have even contributed some stories there, even though they didn't present her in a particularly positive light. So I think watch the space. She's came back from that 2010 News of the World sting, and you would have thought that would be the end of most people. So I don't think we should write her off totally now. Having said I thought she couldn't come back.
And it was also reported yesterday the Charity Commission is going to investigate William's Earthshot Prize. And it seems related to the fact that one of the founding members was none other than Sultan bin Sulayem. So this is the guy who owns the global logistics giant DP World. He's connected to Epstein. There's been some speculation that he sent the I loved the torture video email. Would William have been warned about his Epstein connections? And do you think he was unwise to take his money?
Well, I think he should have been warned if he wasn't. I think there's always this great sort of dilemma because there are large sums of money involved for their pet projects, the same with Charles and Dumfries House. And it's very tempting to take the money and hope that no one notices. So, yeah, I suspect he was briefed and they took a decision that it was worth the risk because of the sums involved. But all these people they haven't committed crimes, but they do have not the best reputations. So it must be very difficult. But I feel slightly sorry for William because clearly he is not involved with Epstein, any of the Epstein material. I think he's kind of playing catch up at the moment to find out what the full story is. I mean, he's never had any illusions about what his uncle is like. So, and he's kind of been treated a bit as the lightning conductor. He was sent out there with the sort of testing statement to perhaps see what the reaction was. Of course, he was the guy who was made to drive Andrew to church one day to show that they're all bosom pals. So I think he will be slightly more assertive in future. I think he will go his own way talking about things and not follow the protocol that he has to fall into line behind his father because I think he just feels he himself is being hung out to dry slightly on this issue.
And do you think he felt hung out to dry with the King's statement? Because he came out with his statement with the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was widely panned across the press and also by members of the public on social media. Charles then comes out with a much more fulsome statement mentioning that we stand ready to help the police. Do you think William felt one up by that? And do you think that's contributed to further tensions between the Prince of Wales and the King?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. The plan under Christopher Geidt was to have a sort of uniform communications section where they all sort of talk to each other. People were everything was coordinated, and that seems to fall apart. The Williams household and the King's household seem to operate independently, and I suspect there is a little bit of one-upmanship going on here, which will have irritated William. We know the relations are not good. The fact he didn't turn up to the screening of his father's film, which was so important to him, I think was a pretty obvious slap in the face for his father. So I think people are saying that actually the difficulties between William and Charles are actually greater than between Harry and Charles. They can kind of contain Harry. It's much more difficult to do that for William. So that is a big problem. We've got reduction in respect for various institutions, including the monarchy. We have a king who is not well physically, and then who is actually at war with both his sons, including the future heir. It's not a very promising prospect.
Epstein described himself as close to Tony Blair and also spoke admiringly about the tens of millions that Blair was making in Kazakhstan. What do you know about the relationship between Blair and Epstein? So we know they had a meeting in number 10 in 2002 before his convictions came to light. But did their acquaintance stretch beyond that, or indeed beyond the 2007 conviction?
Well, this is an area that I'm looking into at the moment. I mean, I do have some information, but only from one source, so I need to back it up. That they were very close, close socially as well as in terms of business, doing very similar business activities. So I think I just need to do a bit more work on that. But it does suggest that from what I'm finding, that Blair is much more deeply involved in this story than I think people realized.
So, do you think the floodgates are opening now? And do you think former protection officers and diplomatic staff will now feel more free to come forward? Or do you think the usual threats to their careers will still preclude them from doing this?
Well, I hope that they will be encouraged to speak to the police. I mean, not necessarily to writers like me, so that we can clear up exactly what the situation was. I think the worrying news that I'm getting is that the King has actually been doubling down on members of staff about their obligations and the NDAs. So now that may be just to stop them talking to the press. And is he still going to be allowing them to talk to the police? Because I think that is important, that the police should have as full a picture as possible of Andrew's activities, seeing what he was doing and how he was opening himself up to potential blackmail through some of his activities, like these honey traps.
Have you seen a notable uptick in people coming forward to you in, say, the last couple of weeks?
Yes, I have. I mean, I had dinner last night with one person came forward. I'm actually having dinner again tonight with someone else. So, and I've got a meeting at 2:30 this afternoon with someone. So, yes, there are a lot of people coming forward, partly occasioned by reading the book or seeing publicity, from podcasts or articles. But people do feel, I think, particularly in the light of the recent releases, an obligation, a higher loyalty to actually come clean about what was going on.
So there was an extraordinary report in the Times today that a woman described as close to Andrew had offered to help Epstein set up a modeling agency and that it would help him access what you were looking for easily, which meant 16-year-old girls. And she asked for $11 million to make this happen. Do we have any idea who that might be? And how would you suggest people out there go about trying to find out who it might be?
Well, I don't know who it is. I think all we can do is hope that more material is appears in the releases that will give us some clues, perhaps in the language it's used, or perhaps even just some more detail. Maybe someone will come forward who knows this person. I do know that Andrew, for example, was trafficking some of his girlfriends to Epstein, who was then passing them on to people like Trump. Now these people are very respectable housewives in the home counties, married to rich bankers. But yeah, it is a mystery. It's a great coup to have got that material, and I hope that in the next few days more material might emerge in some form or other.
And how big do you think this scandal will get? And how many more high-profile British figures do you think might still be encompassed in it?
Well, we've had various names mentioned already. I mean, Richard Branson is come in under the sort of microscope. There is talk of this former prime minister of being involved in an orgy or a threesome. So Epstein would have targeted. I mean, judging from the people he knew and actually what he was responding wanted to do, which was to target these very important people. I think it's very likely that there will be some high-profile names emerging that we haven't heard before. Epstein's whole raison d'etre was to entrap very influential, powerful, rich people in British society, and he seems to have spread his tentacles very wide, not just in Britain, but around the world. So, yes, I suspect many, many more names will now emerge.
And do you think it's telling that Tony Blair has been completely silent on the Epstein issue? So there hasn't even been a statement saying, yes, I met him in 2002, but it was on the advice of officials. It was before the convictions were known. My thoughts are with the victims, and anything that I can do to help, I stand ready to do so. Do you think it's interesting that there's been nothing from Tony Blair, especially given we've had such a powerful and full-throated call from Gordon Brown for a police investigation, not just into the documents, but into the sex trafficking?
Yes, I do. I do think it's very interesting. I mean, I know the press have been given the name of the ex-prime minister and are looking into it to see if it can stand up. But there have been quite a lot of articles in the press about Blair's being named in these documents for his financial activities. And you would have thought he would have had some rejoinder, but it seems to be he's behaving exactly like Prince Andrew, which is to make no comment whatsoever, which does raise questions about how deeply involved he was with Epstein and his circle.
Apart from Ghislaine Maxwell, why have none of the female enablers been arrested or questioned? And what do we know about them? Do you think part of the point of their role was to protect Epstein and also to blur the line between victim and criminal? Some of them were initially victims and then recruiters. What do we know about this? And could this be the next domino to drop?
Yes, it's very interesting looking at the documents. I mean, people like Leslie Groff, who is his sort of personal assistant, Sarah Kellen, and others are very, very involved in this. And I'm just amazed that they haven't had to give testimony. I mean, they, I think, did give some testimony and pleaded the fifth. Certainly, some of the girls who had themselves been targeted and then became recruiters refused to basically incriminate themselves. But I'm also just amazed that the Senate aren't calling in some of the staff for Epstein in his various properties. And I do hope that if there is an investigation into Andrew, they will be calling the former heads of UKTI, the former ambassadors, but also clearly a lot of these people who are working for Andrew. There's a man called Amit Patel, for example, who pops up in some of the stuff where Andrew is leaking material to Epstein. Amit Patel is clearly not guilty of anything except providing the information to Andrew as he should. But he will presumably know more about it, what Andrew may have said. He would have escorted him on some of these trips. So I do think we do need a slightly more wide-ranging investigation because clearly this material is only material that was pertinent to the DOJ investigation, which had its own prescribed parameters. So I think there's a bigger story here, and we're only getting snippets of it.
And what do you think could still emerge about Eugenie and Beatrice and their financial relationship with Epstein? I've noticed that the press are very reticent to cover this. Why do you think that is?
I think possibly the press are nervous because maybe there have been legal letters. I mean, I know that Beatrice and Eugenie have a very tough sort of PR team, very active PR team. We are waiting to see what emerges. I think if they're sensible, they will have stopped their activities promoting Saudi banks and things. But, clearly there will be material from the past. And clearly Beatrice was a trusted sort of shoulder for both her parents to rest on, to get advice from. She was instrumental in persuading Andrew to do the Newsnight interview, for example. And so she does seem to be very much involved in their activities. We know that money was paid into both her and Eugenie's accounts from the Salman Turk case. We know that she received an £18,000 necklace from Tarek Khatuni, who's one of their business associates, which can't really be explained as a birthday present from someone she hardly knew. So I do think there's a lot more to come out of the daughters, and that's perhaps why the press are waiting just to make sure they've got their ducks in a row. And I think, clearly there is some sympathy amongst the general public for them in the absence of any hard evidence of any criminal activity. And so the press are treading rather carefully. But I think if material does come out that paints them in a pretty, well, in a light in which they haven't behaved very well, then I think that the press attitude may change.
Because one of the frustrating things for me, just as an observer, when I'm reading about this, is how often they're referred to as the girls of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, but they're the same age as me. I mean, they're 40 years old or thereabouts. They haven't been girls for 22 years. So it seems like they shouldn't get a free pass if they have been involved in financial impropriety. You also made a fascinating point in your Substack that I hadn't thought of before, which is that the palace wasted no time in launching an investigation into bullying regarding Meghan, the results of which they kept secret. But they don't seem ever to have commissioned an investigation into Andrew's different allegations, whether it's the sex trafficking, whether it's the sleeping with prostitute, or whether it's the financial impropriety. You mentioned the Salman Turk case there, which you've written extensively about in the book. I think it was £750,000 and a £20,000 necklace. I mean, do you think the palace asked any questions there? Do you think HMRC asked any questions?
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think the Salman Turk High Court case in 2022, in fact, I think it was 1.3 million was paid to the York family, but as you say, 750,000 to Andrew, which he couldn't explain, I think is really important. And that case seems to have been shut down. That, I mean, the hardly covered at all in the press. I suspect there were legal letters sent because the press were very keen to stress that the Yorks had not behaved in any way improperly, when, it's pretty obvious that if you receive money that you can't explain, that is rather suspicious. So I do think there's been a reticence by the palace to deal with these issues. They clearly thought they could get away with it, and people had forgotten about it. I think the Selman Turk case until my book. So you're absolutely right. There is double standards here. You can sympathise with Harry and Meghan that they are being treated differently to the way that Sarah Ferguson and then Andrew were treated. I think Meghan has been trying to sell her jam and things, which is exactly what Sarah Ferguson was doing for 30 years, using her title, which she really wasn't entitled to do. So there has been extraordinary double standards here, and I'm not quite sure why the palace wasn't tougher on Andrew and particularly on Sarah Ferguson, that there wasn't more disciplining of her, because she was pretty shameless in the way she exploited her royal status for her own personal gain. And whether that was just a lack of control, the fact they didn't care, they knew that people weren't going to raise this issue either in the press or elsewhere. But we're now living in a very changed world of social media, of a slightly less deferential press. And I think they can no longer ignore these sort of scandals and just hope they're going to go away, because they're not.
And you've said pretty consistently for the last couple of months that you don't think Andrew will go to jail, largely thanks to the efforts of people like you over the last 2, 3 weeks. And of course, with your book 6 months ago, the CPS is now working with Thames Valley Police, looking into allegations of misconduct in public office, as well as sex trafficking. Do you still think he won't go to jail, or do you think that there's a bigger chance now that he may do?
Well, I think there's a bigger chance now of him being investigated. I think they've got to do that. Having said that they're investigating Peter Mandelson for misconduct in public office, they can hardly not do the same with Andrew. But you're absolutely right. 6 months ago, I had lots of stories of him passing confidential information to people like David Rowlands and Jeffrey Epstein, of shoehorning in meetings in China, of fast-tracking banking licenses for Bank Haviland in the Middle East. And no one seemed at all perturbed. The palace certainly didn't investigate it publicly then. I was talking about the need for a police investigation even then, and nothing happened. I think the Met are now under some pressure to at least to appear to do something. I think they'll play a slight delaying, long game, slightly to kind of kicking it into the long grass. And I don't think he will go to prison, for the simple reason that the palace will not want him to give evidence in court on oath, and therefore they will find some way of getting him out of the country to a country where he won't be extradited, to kind of shut him down. And I think that will not go down well if that happens, because people do want him to face justice and be held accountable.
And you said in one of your Substack articles this week that if Andrew doesn't go to jail, that's what could bring down the monarchy. So if he is spirited out of the country and goes into a kind of self-imposed exile in the Middle East, that would be, as you say, potentially disastrous, maybe even fatal for the monarchy.
Yeah. And I think even if the country doesn't have an extradition treaty, clearly the power of the monarchy could be used with the ruler of whichever country it is to persuade them to cough Andrew up. I mean, we've had this big problem with the Americans not releasing the former CIA agent who killed the poor boy on his motorbike. And we have had problems even with allies not giving up people as they should. But I think, there will be pressure, because even if there isn't an extradition treaty, and I think there are one or two countries in the Middle East where we don't have them for some strange reason, there will be a lot of pressure on the monarchy to persuade the rulers to give him up. The danger is we don't know where he's gone. He'll disappear.
You've only got 8,000 words to add to what is probably the most anticipated paperback edition in publishing history, given what's happened between now and the hardback. How are you choosing those 8,000 words? Do we have a date yet for when the paperback is coming out?
The book will be coming out on the 21st of May. I haven't actually started writing the 8,000 words, but what will happen is, to save the book being reset, I will just add material at the end that kind of conditions what I can put in, because clearly I don't want to repeat information that's there before. I'm going to clearly have to tell the story of the event since the book was actually delivered, which was more than 6 months ago, so that we have a sort of timeline of what's happened and how the family have fallen from grace. But in the course of that, I'm going to be able to hopefully drop in new information I've got, for example, on the daughters, new information I've got at his time as a trade envoy, particularly stuff that was taken out, for example, the material on Peter Mandelson, but also Andrew's activities in Mongolia, Libya, China. There will be some more material on the relationship with Epstein, which has now emerged, because of course it's not just the stuff from the releases. I mean, that's 6 million or 3 million pages I've got to incorporate, and all, with all the news coverage, but also the people who've come forward. And there's about 150 pages of notes from the people who've come forward, which I'm going to have to integrate. But I will be dropping a lot of this information into my Substack each week, so that will be a good way of getting it, and beginning to write a book called Untitled, which is about Epstein and the House of Windsor, which will look at the story again in much, much more detail, with the focus entirely on that Epstein relationship and perhaps the relationship he had with other members of the royal family, because I think that will begin to emerge. We know that Michael Wolff has seen pictures that Epstein showed him of other members of the royal family with Epstein.